You hear it all the time, right? Listen to the experts. They've got the inside track, the experience, the secret sauce. But when it comes to your money, to your investments, does following all that advice actually work? Today, we're digging into that exact question. Do financial experts really beat the market? And let me tell you, the answer, when you look at decades of data, might just blow your mind. So, where does our story start? Well, funny enough, on a comedy show. The year is 2009. We're in the middle of the smoldering wreckage of the financial crisis, and Jon Stewart on The Daily Show has just set his sights on the financial news network CNBC. He's asking a pretty simple question. How could all of its experts have gotten things so unbelievably wrong? Stewart just started rolling these clips, and they were absolutely devastating. First one up, Mad Money host Jim Cramer, talking to a viewer who was, a little nervous about the investment bank Bear Stearns, and Cramer's advice was crystal clear. And then the punchline. Just a simple black screen with the brutal, cold, hard fact. Bear Stearns was, not fine. That gap between the absolute certainty in his voice and the catastrophic reality, it was just staggering. And get this, it wasn't just a one-off thing. Nope. Here's another commentator on the same network confidently explaining why the investment bank Lehman Brothers was totally different from the already failed Bear Stearns. The message, don't worry, this time is different. And you guessed it, another update screen, this back and forth rhythm, expert says everything's fine, then reality comes crashing in. It just built this incredibly powerful case, even if it was just anecdotal, that something was seriously off with the advice being broadcast to millions. Jon Stewart just tied it all together with this absolute gem of a line. I mean, it's hilarious, right? But it also perfectly nailed the bitter frustration of so many people who watched their life savings just disappear, all while being told not to worry. Now, look, that was amazing television, no question. But it does bring up a fair point. Was this just a comedian doing what comedians do? Cherry-picking the absolute worst examples for a good laugh. I mean, anybody who makes thousands of predictions is going to have some bad calls. To be fair, we can't just go off a few clips. We need some actual hard data. And that's exactly what happened. 3 academic researchers decided to go check the receipts. They put together a formal study, putting Jim Cramer's hugely popular show Mad Money under a statistical microscope to answer one question. If you had followed his advice, would you have actually made any money? And these guys, they did not mess around. They looked at nearly 1,200 of Cramer's first-time buy calls over a 4-year period. And the conclusion? A portfolio built from his picks performed no better than just buying the whole market. Actually, it gets worse. For most of the time periods they looked at, it actually lost money compared to the market. But here's where it gets really interesting. That doesn't mean Cramer had no effect. Oh no, far from it. The study found this incredibly powerful thing they called the Cramer bump. What it means is, on average, a stock he recommended would pop. It would jump up by 2.4%, literally overnight, between when he said buy and when the market opened the next day. Okay, so who's actually pocketing that 2.4% bump? Well, here's the crucial part. It's not the viewer at home. By the time you watch the show, get excited, and try to buy that stock the next morning, the price has already jumped. You're buying high. And the result? Portfolios built on that strategy consistently underperform the market by a massive 3 to 10% every single year. The very act of following the expert advice basically set you up to fail. All right, so that's one famous pundit. But what happens when a whole bunch of experts agree? What about consensus? Let's check out our next case, which is the totally fascinating story of something called the Elves Index from the really well-respected show Wall Street Week. So here's how this worked. The host, a guy named Louis Rukeyser, would poll 10 of his top market analysts every single week. He'd tally up who was bullish, who was bearish, and who was neutral, and he created this simple little gauge of what the experts were thinking. A high positive score meant everyone was optimistic. A negative score meant they were all pessimistic. Simple enough, right? Well, the results were just wild. The index became famous for having a spectacular record of being completely and totally wrong. At the exact moment in 1990, when the experts were most pessimistic, the market hit rock bottom and started a huge bull run. And when they were the most optimistic ever, in late 1999, that was right before the dot-com bubble exploded. It was so consistently wrong that traders started using it as a contrarian indicator. Literally, they would do the exact opposite of what the expert consensus was telling them to do. Okay, I know what you might be thinking. That's all free advice on TV. The advice you actually pay for, that's gotta be better. And that's a fair point. I mean, if a newsletter wasn't delivering, why would you keep subscribing? So for our final test, let's zoom out and look at the entire industry of paid financial newsletters. So this data comes from the Hulbert Financial Digest, which tracked hundreds of these newsletters for over 3 decades. And wow, the numbers just don't lie. Over 30 years, the average paid newsletter returned about 8.4% a year. A simple do-nothing S&P 500 index fund, that returned 12.1%. As a whole, the very people you pay to give you expert stock picks significantly underperformed just buying the market. But hold on, you're probably thinking, well, I'm smarter than that. I'll just subscribe to the ones with the best track records. I'll pick the past winners. Well, researchers tested that exact strategy. They looked at what would happen if you only followed the newsletters that were the top performers in previous years. And the result? It didn't work. Even the strategy of picking the proven winners still couldn't beat the S&P 500 in the long run. So we've looked at a TV superstar, a panel of top analysts, and an entire industry that you pay for advice. A pretty clear picture is starting to form, isn't it? Let's just state the conclusion as plainly as possible. This is really the heart of it all. The myth versus the reality. The common belief, the misconception, is that listening to financial experts gives an average person like you or me an edge. But the reality, based on just a mountain of evidence, is that expert advice doesn't just fail to beat the market, it actually seems to do worse than random chance. And that brings us to a conclusion from our source material that sounds like a joke, but it's not. If expert performance is, on average, worse than random, then it means that a chimpanzee throwing darts at a newspaper's stock page wouldn't just do as well as the so-called experts. Statistically, the chimp would do better. Just let that sink in for a second. It is a wild thought. So where does that leave us? I mean, if we can't trust the experts, what are we supposed to do? Well, the source material suggests 2 very clear paths forward. Path number 1 is beautifully simple. Just buy a broad, low-cost index fund. You accept the market's average return, which, as we've just seen, is way better than what most of the experts can deliver. Path number 2, if you really love the game and the challenge of it all, is to develop your own methodology, one that's built by you for you. And that really brings us to this final thought from the legendary trader Michael Marcus. The big takeaway from all this evidence isn't that you should give up. It's that you should feel empowered. Instead of just blindly following what somebody else tells you to do, the data says you're probably better off either just taking the market's return or putting in the work to forge your own path. And really, the question this all leaves us with is, which light are you going to follow?